In the glittering halls of Versailles, where candlelight never dies and mirrors reflect eternity, a young woman was quietly rotting from within. Physicians dismissed her as hysterical. Courtiers mocked her for being shy and overweight. Yet every breath she took was a war against decay. Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria, the forgotten Dauphine of France, died at just 29. As silently as if she had never lived at all, Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria was born into a world of ceremony and reverence. A daughter of Ferdinand Maria, Elector of Bavaria, and Henriette Adelaide of Savoy. From her earliest years, her life was a performance of grace, modesty, and quiet obedience. The Bavarian court in Munich was not a place of reckless luxury like Versailles. It was steeped in Catholic devotion, musical refinement, and a sense of duty that ran like cold water beneath its marble floors. Maria Anna learned early how to bow, how to pray, and how to silence her own desires in favor of divine will. Her education was impeccable. She spoke fluent French and Italian, painted in miniature, and played the harpsichord with a melancholy tenderness that her tutors often praised. But even as a child, there was something fragile about her, a gentleness that seemed unsuited to the brutal theater of European politics. Her governess once wrote, "The princess is good beyond reason. She forgives too easily. One fears that the world will not forgive her back." When she turned 19, that fear began to come true. France, the most powerful kingdom in Europe, was searching for a bride for the Grand Dauphin, Louis, the only legitimate son of the Sun King, Louis XIV. The match was not born of affection, but of strategy. France needed to cement its alliance with Bavaria, whose loyalty could prove crucial in the balance of power against the Habsburgs. To the Bavarian court, this was triumph. To Maria Anna, it was exile disguised as honor. She understood, perhaps better than her father, that she was being offered as a living treaty, her smile, her womb, her entire existence becoming a diplomatic instrument. On a winter's morning in 1679, she watched as the carriages were prepared to carry her away from Munich. Snow fell over the cobblestones like slow-burning ash, and the sound of hooves echoed like a funeral march. Her mother kissed her hands and whispered, "Be patient. Be good. France will love you if you are kind." Maria Anna smiled faintly, but said nothing. She knew that kindness alone had never tamed power. The journey to France was long and ceremonial. Each border crossing came with its rituals, guards saluting, officials bowing, priests offering blessings. At every stop, courtiers analyzed her face as if searching for flaws in marble. Too pale, they said, too round-faced. Her eyes, though clear and intelligent, carried a constant sadness that made others uncomfortable. "She looks as if she's always about to cry," one French attendant wrote. And perhaps she was. When she finally reached Versailles in early 1680, she entered a world that seemed both divine and suffocating. The palace shimmered with mirrors and gold, with gardens stretched like illusions beneath the morning mist. But the air itself felt heavy, perfumed, artificial, and dense with unspoken judgment. Louis XIV greeted her with majestic courtesy. He was the embodiment of theatrical power, a man whose every gesture had been rehearsed before the gaze of Europe. "Welcome to France, my daughter," he said. "Here, beauty is a duty." Those words, though said kindly, pierced her. She realized that in this world, her worth would be measured not by virtue or intellect, but by the cruel economy of appearance. Her husband, the Grand Dauphin Louis, stood beside his father, broad-shouldered, handsome, and profoundly uninterested. He bowed perfunctorily, offering a small smile that failed to reach his eyes. It was not hatred she sensed in him, but indifference, which was somehow worse. Maria Anna curtsied deeply, her gown rustling like wings of a caged bird. In that instant, she knew her fate was sealed. The wedding took place on March 7, 1680, in the Royal Chapel of Versailles. The ceremony was magnificent, choirs singing, incense rising, nobles whispering behind jeweled fans. To the court, it was a spectacle of alliance and prosperity. To Maria Anna, it was a quiet burial of her own will. As the ring slipped onto her finger, she felt an almost physical detachment from herself, as if watching another woman make the vows. That night, alone in her chambers, she stood before the tall mirrors that multiplied her reflection infinitely. The candles flickered, and she studied her own face, the nervous eyes, the trembling mouth. She whispered a prayer her mother had taught her. "May my heart not harden under the weight of splendor." Outside, music drifted through the corridors, muffled laughter echoing through the halls. Versailles was alive, a golden organism pulsing with ambition and vanity. Yet Maria Anna felt invisible within it, a small foreign body within the Sun King's universe. The French courtiers found her accent quaint, her manners too reserved, her attire too modest. They called her La Petite Allemande, the little German girl. She tried to adapt. She attended the royal balls, learning to glide across the floor in the endless dance of protocol. She smiled when expected, bowed when required, and learned to hide her exhaustion behind the powder and silk. Yet each day, she felt herself fading a little, like a candle burning quietly behind the blinding chandeliers. Letters from Munich became her lifeline. She wrote to her sister, "Versailles dazzles the eyes, but chills the soul. I walk among mirrors, but none of them show me as I am." Those who read her words centuries later would see the slow birth of tragedy, a gentle spirit caught in the machinery of a world that prized spectacle over sincerity. By the end of her first year in France, Maria Anna had become what the court wanted: polite, silent, and ornamental. She fulfilled her duties, performed her devotions, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Yet beneath the lace and the ceremony, something in her began to fracture. The quiet understanding that love in Versailles was a rumor at best. In her diary, she wrote a final line before sleep one night. "I am the bride of France, but France has no heart." And so began the slow unraveling of the woman who would one day die unseen, her body betraying her long before her nation ever noticed she was gone. Versailles was not a palace, it was a stage. Every gesture, every smile, every breath existed under the scrutiny of 1,000 watching eyes. For Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria, newly arrived from the quiet piety of Munich, it felt less like entering a royal home and more like stepping into a living theater where she was the reluctant actress. From dawn until nightfall, her life unfolded according to ritual. Courtiers observed her waking, her dressing, her breakfast. Servants whispered about the way she held her spoon, the tone of her prayers, the thickness of her German accent. Even her silence was interpreted as arrogance or dullness. Versailles demanded charm, wit, and scandal, all the qualities Maria Anna had been raised to avoid. She tried at first to win their affection. She smiled too often, spoke too softly, offered gifts of embroidery and music. But the French court thrived on cruelty disguised as refinement. The duchesses and marquises, powdered like porcelain ghosts, dissected her every misstep. "Too shy," they said, "too plain." Others mocked her for being devout, for avoiding the flirtations that kept Versailles alive. In a world where sin was fashionable, virtue was unfashionable, even suspicious. At evening receptions, she would stand quietly while others laughed and gossiped around her. The courtiers' words floated like perfume, sweet on the surface but laced with venom. She has no wit. She blushes like a schoolgirl. A Dauphine should sparkle, not shiver. Sometimes, she caught her reflection in the great mirrors of the Hall of Mirrors, a small figure swallowed by gold and glass, her expression soft but anxious. Her body already growing rounder under the weight of loneliness. The cruel nickname came soon enough. La Grosse Dauphine, the Fat Dauphine. It spread through the salons like perfume, always accompanied by polite laughter. To be called grosse in Versailles was not a description. It was an accusation, a declaration of moral failure. They said her plumpness was a sign of gluttony, of weakness, of German vulgarity. Her body became public property, a topic for gossip between men sipping wine and women fanning themselves beside the king's chamber. Louis XIV did not intervene. The Sun King was too consumed with his own glory to notice the dimming of one small star in his court. To him, Maria Anna was a political formality, the mother of his future dynasty. The Dauphin, her husband, shared his father's indifference. He was polite in public, but distant in private, his affections reserved for his mistresses, who mocked Maria Anna openly. Once, during a banquet, a lady-in-waiting whispered a cruel joke about the Dauphine's figure. The entire table laughed, including her husband. Maria Anna lowered her eyes and smiled faintly, as etiquette required, though her hands trembled beneath the tablecloth. To survive in Versailles, one had to learn to act. And so she began to act. She wore the finest gowns of silk and lace, though their weight made her dizzy. She painted her cheeks to hide her pallor, though the powder burned her skin. She attended the king's entertainments, smiling while her lungs ached and her heart beat irregularly. Beneath the gilded ceilings, she learned that invisibility was safer than sincerity. At night, she wrote long letters to her family in Bavaria. "They think me slow," she confided, "because I cannot dance as fast as their words. Their beauty is sharp like a knife. Mine is soft and unwanted. I try to be pleasing, but I feel as though I am made of another material entirely." She never sent some of these letters. She tore them to pieces, afraid they might be intercepted and used against her. In Versailles, even ink could become a weapon. Her health began to waver, though few noticed. The palace was drafty and perfumed, filled with smoke from hundreds of candles that never ceased to burn. She coughed through the nights, her body heavy, her breath shallow. The doctors prescribed walks in the gardens and laughter at the king's comedies, remedies fit for an illusion, not a woman in pain. Still, she forced herself to attend every ceremony. She was the Dauphine, after all. Her presence was required to represent the virtue of France, even if France refused to acknowledge her own suffering. During processions, she stood beside the king and the Dauphin, her face a mask of serenity. But the gossip behind her back was relentless. Her German manners were mocked, her pious silence mistaken for stupidity. The women of the court played their games with elegant cruelty. Madame de Montespan, the king's former mistress, once remarked within earshot, "She prays too much. God must be tired of hearing her." Another noblewoman said, "It is strange that such a round face could hold so little light." Laughter followed like applause. In private, Maria Anna wept quietly, but never aloud. Her confessor, a kindly priest from Paris, once asked her if she hated them for their cruelty. She answered, No, I pity them. They have replaced the soul with perfume. But pity did not protect her. The loneliness deepened, thick as the powdered air around her. She began to withdraw even further, seeking solace in the chapel, where flickering candlelight cast long shadows over her folded hands. The scent of wax and incense comforted her more than any human voice. Here, away from mirrors and laughter, she could simply exist without being judged. Yet even in prayer, she could not escape the sound of Versailles, the laughter echoing through marble corridors, the music of harpsichords bleeding through the walls. The palace was a living organism that thrived on spectacle, and she was the cell that did not belong. In the portraits painted during those early years, she appears serene, perhaps even content. But if one looks closer, beyond the satin and pearls, there is a subtle defiance in her gaze, a quiet awareness that she is not truly seen. The artist captured it unintentionally. The melancholy of a woman who has realized that the world around her prefers illusion to truth. By the time her first son was born, the courtiers had already lost interest in her. She was no longer new, no longer amusing to mock. Versailles had moved on to fresher scandals and younger beauties. Maria Anna, the foreign bride who once symbolized alliance, now lived in the background, a polite shadow in a palace built for sunlight. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, a slow rot had begun. Not just in her lungs or her liver, but in her spirit. She did not know it yet, but Versailles had already started to kill her. Not with poison or blade, but with the cruelty of laughter and the loneliness of too much gold. From the moment she became the Dauphine of France, Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria understood that her marriage was not a union of hearts, but an alliance of empires. Versailles did not marry for affection. It married for strategy, bloodlines, and political symmetry. The Grand Dauphin Louis, her husband, embodied that principle with cold perfection. Louis, the only legitimate son of the Sun King, had grown up amid flattery and indulgence. Surrounded by servants who never contradicted him and mistresses who entertained his whims, he had learned to confuse power with pleasure. Handsome, broad-shouldered, and disarmingly lazy, he carried himself like a man who believed the world existed to serve his appetite. Maria Anna was meant to balance that arrogance with virtue and fertility. A quiet Bavarian lamb beside a spoiled French lion. But Louis did not want a wife. He wanted freedom, or at least amusement. He visited her chambers in the early days of marriage, fulfilling his duty to the dynasty with mechanical precision. The encounters were formal, brief, and silent. When they were over, he would bow slightly, say, "Bonsoir, madame," and leave for the rooms of his mistresses. The coldness of those nights settled into Maria Anna's bones. At first, she tried to believe that time would change him. She prayed, as she had been taught, that obedience and gentleness could soften even the hardest heart. She sent him notes written in careful French, expressing gratitude, hope, and admiration. He never replied. Once, during a hunt, she approached him shyly, asking if he might join her for music that evening. He laughed, not cruelly, but as though she had told a childish joke, and galloped away. Gradually, the Dauphin's disinterest became public knowledge. Versailles, a place where every rumor was oxygen, thrived on the spectacle of their detachment. Servants whispered about the silent dinners, the empty corridors between their apartments. Courtiers exchanged knowing glances when they saw her alone at Mass. One nobleman even jested that the Dauphine is married to God and the Dauphin to himself. The laughter that followed was thin and sharp, like glass shattering on marble. Maria Anna's loneliness deepened. but she hid it behind courtesy. Her mornings began with prayer and her evenings with embroidery. She attended the royal entertainments, clapping politely while others danced. When her husband passed her in the hall, she curtsied. He acknowledged her with a nod. Nothing more. And yet, despite the emptiness of their union, she continued to speak of him kindly to her ladies-in-waiting. "He is tired," she would say. "He carries the burden of the future." But the truth was that Louis carried nothing but boredom. He found his pleasures in hunting, gambling, and women who flattered his vanity. His favorite mistress, Mademoiselle de Chouin, was everything Maria Anna was not: lively, witty, and irreverent. The court adored her for the same reasons it scorned the Dauphine. Once, when Maria Anna entered a salon unexpectedly, the laughter fell silent for a heartbeat. Then someone whispered, "The ghost of duty walks among us." The cruelty was polished, elegant, and merciless. In her private chambers, Maria Anna surrounded herself with reminders of Bavaria. Small religious icons, portraits of her parents, the faint scent of pine oil brought from Munich. Her ladies, most of them assigned by the French court, pitied her in silence, but never dared to show it. Pity was dangerous in Versailles. It could be mistaken for disloyalty. She began writing letters home again, though her tone grew heavier. "Louis is kind," she wrote, "but he lives as though I am not here. I do not hate him for it. Perhaps he was never taught to see what is quiet." Her mother responded with gentle admonitions to endure. "Patience is the crown of a wife," she said. But patience, Maria Anna discovered, was a fragile crown, one that cracked under the weight of neglect. There were moments when she wondered whether God had forgotten her too. Her confessor assured her that suffering was the path to grace. Christ also knew loneliness, he told her. "In your sorrow, you mirror the divine." She smiled politely, but the words did little to ease the ache. It was not holiness she wanted. It was warmth. When she gave birth to her first son, Louis, in 1682, the palace celebrated. Cannons fired, choirs sang, and courtiers toasted the continuation of the Bourbon line. The king himself visited her chamber, declaring that France had been blessed. Maria Anna lay pale on the bed, drenched in sweat, smiling faintly through exhaustion. The Dauphin stood beside her for a few minutes, said a few obligatory words of praise, then excused himself. That night, he attended a masquerade. Motherhood brought her fleeting moments of joy. The baby's small fingers wrapped around hers, and for a brief time, she felt needed. But even that comfort was stolen from her. The royal nurses and tutors quickly took control of the infant's care, as custom dictated. The Dauphine, they said, must rest and return to her duties as ornament of the court. She was allowed to see her child only at scheduled times, under the watchful eyes of attendants. The sound of her own son's crying reached her rooms at night, carried faintly through the corridors, haunting and unreachable. In those quiet hours, she would walk alone in the gardens, the only place where she could breathe without being watched. The moonlight shimmered over the fountains, the statues frozen mid-dance. "They are beautiful," she once whispered to her maid, "because they cannot feel." The maid did not answer. By the time her second and third sons were born, Maria Anna had ceased to hope for affection. Her body weakened with each pregnancy, her spirit dimming further. Yet she continued to fulfill every duty expected of her. She smiled at ceremonies, bowed at banquets, and endured the endless parade of whispers about her health, her figure, her lack of charm. The Dauphin visited her only when required by duty. Sometimes, Weeks passed without a word. She began to recognize the sound of his footsteps only by their absence. And when she caught glimpses of him with his mistresses, laughing, radiant, alive, she felt no anger, only the dull ache of being unseen. In her diary, she wrote one night, "It is strange to share a roof, but not a life. He does not hate me. I am simply transparent to him. I think indifference is a colder death than hatred." Versailles, meanwhile, moved forward in its endless dance of luxury and decay. The fountains still sang, the music still played, and Maria Anna, the Dauphine of France, continued her silent existence within the palace that glittered like a coffin made of gold. She was the embodiment of a perfect wife in the eyes of the court, obedient, discreet, and invisible. But beneath her calm surface, the first shadows of her final illness had begun to stir. Small, silent betrayals inside her body, waiting for their hour. She could not know yet that her greatest battle would not be against loneliness, but against herself. Against the body that would slowly turn into her own executioner. Motherhood in Versailles was both a triumph and a trial. For the Dauphine, it was the only sphere where she could momentarily feel useful. The one role no courtier could mock, no mistress could replace. Yet for Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria, that triumph became a cruel descent, each childbirth carving away a piece of her fragile body until there was almost nothing left to give. Her first pregnancy in 1681 had been celebrated like a national event. The king himself thanked God before the entire court. Bells rang across Paris, and poets composed verses about the future of France resting in her womb. But the glory of that promise hid a darker truth. The palace doctors treated her not as a woman, but as a vessel of state. They prescribed endless tonics and strict diets, dictated when she should walk, when she should sleep, and when she should smile for the king. Her body ceased to belong to her. It became property, sacred, but impersonal. The birth of her first son nearly killed her. The labor lasted more than 20 hours, the screams muffled behind heavy curtains as courtiers waited outside the chamber for news. The midwives whispered prayers, the doctors whispered theories. When the child was finally delivered, pale and silent, Maria Anna fainted from exhaustion. She woke to the sound of cannon fire and church bells, a nation rejoicing while her body bled quietly into the linens. Her recovery was slow, and her strength never fully returned. She suffered from fevers, swollen limbs, and fainting spells. But only a year later, she was pregnant again. "France needs heirs," said the king's physician. "It is God's will." She did not argue. At Versailles, even pain was expected to be graceful. Her second pregnancy in 1682 was harder. She vomited constantly, her body trembling with chills. Some believed it was divine punishment for her melancholy. Others said her German constitution was too delicate for the vigor of French life. She smiled faintly whenever they spoke of it, though her eyes hollowed with fatigue. When her second son was born, another boy, strong and crying, the king declared her the perfect Dauphine. But Maria Anna could barely lift her head to see him. Her hands trembled as she tried to touch her child's face. She was praised for her obedience and fecundity, as if motherhood were an act of courtly etiquette. Courtiers bowed, congratulated her, then quickly moved on to discuss the next ball. Her husband visited briefly, thanked her with a mechanical politeness, and left to dine elsewhere. That night, she whispered to her maid, "It feels as though I give life only to lose a part of mine, each time." The maid said nothing, Silence was the safest form of compassion in Versailles. By the time she conceived her third son, her health was visibly collapsing. Her complexion, once pale and luminous, turned waxen. Her breath grew short. Still, no one dared to advise rest. To be idle was to invite gossip. To appear frail was to disappoint the king. She must not forget her duty. The courtiers said, "A Dauphine cannot be weak." In the final months of her pregnancy, she began to cough blood. The palace doctors called it a chest inflammation, prescribing leeches and potions of mercury. When the pain worsened, they blamed her for nervous sensitivity. Her confessor alone saw the truth, that she was wasting away, her strength consumed by endless expectations. "I am tired of being useful," she told him once. "Even my suffering seems to serve others." The third childbirth, in 1685, was her undoing. The delivery left her barely conscious, her pulse faint, her skin drenched in sweat. The child, Charles, the youngest, survived, but the mother did not recover. Her body, drained of vitality, became a fragile instrument of decay. For weeks she remained bedridden, shivering under layers of silk and furs while the palace celebrated another heir. Outside her chamber, Versailles glittered on as if nothing had happened. Music, laughter, the scent of perfume. The same artificial paradise that had greeted her upon arrival. Inside, Maria Anna lay motionless, her hair falling out in clumps, her once round face now gaunt. The ladies in waiting tried to powder her cheeks to mask the pallor, but her skin no longer absorbed color. "It is like painting marble," one whispered. Each time she tried to stand, her legs trembled. Her appetite vanished, replaced by nausea and a strange metallic taste in her mouth. She began to dread mirrors. Her reflection had become a stranger's. Hollow eyes, thin lips, and the distant look of someone already rehearsing for death. Yet she endured it all without complaint. In her letters, she still wrote with courtesy and restraint. "God is teaching me patience," she said. "And patience is the last jewel a woman must wear." Versailles, however, had little patience for weakness. The courtiers began to tire of her sickliness. When she failed to appear at the royal banquets, they murmured that she was lazy. When she did attend, pale and trembling, they whispered that she was pretending. The king himself, though not unkind, grew distant. He had built Versailles as a monument to vitality, to beauty, power, and divine order. A dying woman, especially one so young, did not fit the image. Her husband's indifference hardened into avoidance. He began to spend more nights away, hunting or entertaining his mistresses. Sometimes, she would wait for him long after midnight, the candles burning low, her hands folded on her lap. The door never opened. When asked by her attendants why she waited, she answered softly, "Because hope is a habit that dies slower than love." By 1686, Maria Anna's body bore the quiet scars of service. The service of a wife, a mother, a political figurehead. She had fulfilled her duties to France 3 times over, and yet the reward was isolation. Even the church, her last refuge, offered little comfort now. The incense made her cough, and the marble floors felt cold beneath her weakening knees. Still, she prayed. She prayed not for healing, but for mercy, not for life, but for peace. In her final months of strength, she began to keep a small diary where she wrote simple, haunting lines. "My body is a house with broken windows. The light comes in, but it cannot stay. They say I am blessed with sons, but I feel hollowed by each one." In Versailles, even suffering must look elegant. Outside her window, The fountain still danced to music, the lilies bloomed, and the courtiers played their endless games of vanity. Inside, the Dauphine of France faded quietly. Her youth consumed not by scandal or sin, but by the relentless expectation to be perfect. She had given France 3 princes and her entire being. And in return, Versailles gave her silence. By the winter of 1686, the glow that had once made Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria appear youthful and gentle had disappeared completely. Her body, though still wrapped in layers of silk and brocade, had become a cage of pain. Her skin turned yellowish, her eyes sunk deeper into their sockets, and her breathing came in fragile bursts that echoed faintly against the high ceilings of her chamber. Yet, in the eyes of Versailles, she was not ill. She was merely unpleasant. The first symptoms were brushed aside. A persistent cough, fatigue, pain in her chest and abdomen. They were considered the complaints of a woman too sensitive for court life. The royal physicians, loyal to the Sun King's image of perfection, refused to admit that the Dauphine, the very symbol of dynastic continuity, might be dying. They called her ailments nervous vapors, a favorite diagnosis for women whose suffering did not fit their limited understanding of the body. "She worries too much," one doctor said. "Perhaps a visit to the opera will restore her spirits." But nothing restored her. The cough deepened, thick with blood. Her stomach swelled painfully, as if filling with something heavier than air. At night, she could not lie flat without feeling suffocated, so she slept half-sitting, surrounded by pillows embroidered with fleurs de lis, the symbol of France pressing against her every breath. When her maids changed her linens, they saw the stains of infection, the bruises blooming on her arms, the thin blue veins visible through her skin. Versailles, however, did not slow for illness. The endless rhythm of banquets, balls, and processions continued. Courtiers still whispered gossip in the mirrored halls, discussing the Dauphine's pallor as if it were a fashion statement rather than a warning. "She is too pale for someone so young," they said. "Perhaps she fasts too often." Some even laughed, suggesting that her faith had consumed her more than her sickness. Only her confessor and a few attendants truly saw her decline. Her voice grew weaker each day, her hands trembling even as she tried to write to her family in Bavaria. The letters became shorter, the handwriting smaller, as if she were trying to conserve her last reserves of strength. "The air here does not love me," she wrote. "It feels heavy, full of invisible things that make me sink." Behind her gentle phrasing lay something terrifying, a body in slow collapse. Modern historians and physicians, centuries later, would suspect that Maria Anna suffered from tuberculous peritonitis, an infection spreading from her lungs to the lining of her abdomen. In an age without antibiotics or clear diagnosis, such a disease would have been a death sentence. The symptoms, fever, bloating, shortness of breath, pain in the side, weakness, were all there. Yet, in the 17th century, to die without visible wounds was to die of imagination. Her attendants noticed a strange odor in the room, faint but persistent, the scent of decay beneath perfume. They lit more candles to mask it, and her maid sprinkled rosewater around her bed. She herself could smell it sometimes, though she never said so. Instead, she whispered to her maid, "It seems my body wants to leave me before my soul is ready." The king's doctors visited occasionally, moving around her bed like actors in a performance. They took her pulse, nodded gravely, and prescribed leeches or purgatives. One insisted that her melancholy was the cause, that her excess of devotion had disturbed the balance of her humors. Too much prayer dries the blood, he said solemnly. The irony of it would have been almost laughable if it were not so cruel. Even the priests began to wonder whether her suffering was divine chastisement. Perhaps God tests the pious most severely, one suggested. Maria Anna only smiled faintly. If that is true, she replied, then I must be very dear to him. It was not sarcasm, it was exhaustion shaped into faith. By the beginning of 1687, the disease had spread. Her abdomen swelled grotesquely, her movements reduced to small gestures. Each breath scraped her throat raw, and her voice began to fade into whispers. She could no longer walk through the gardens she loved. Instead, she asked her maid to describe them. The sound of fountains, the scent of lilies, the laughter of courtiers she would never join again. "Tell me," she said one evening, "do the fountains still dance when no one is watching?" The maid hesitated, unsure whether it was a metaphor or a genuine question. "Yes, madame," she said softly. "They dance for you." Maria Anna nodded, her eyes distant. Then perhaps I still belong here in some way. But she didn't. The court had already begun to turn away. Rumors spread that her illness was exaggerated. Some even accused her of feigning it to gain sympathy. The nickname La Grosse Dauphine, the Fat Dauphine, returned with sharper cruelty. Her swollen belly, caused by infection and fluid retention, became the subject of laughter. "She eats too well," they said. "She refuses to move." To the courtiers, everything that could not be understood was ridiculed. The Dauphin himself visited her less and less. When he did, it was brief and uncomfortable. He stood beside her bed, hands clasped behind his back, speaking of trivial matters, the king's new gardens, the next hunt, the weather. She tried to smile, though her lips were cracked and dry. Once she gathered her strength to say, "Louis, I think I am dying." He replied without meeting her eyes, "Do not speak so, madame. The king dislikes talk of death." Then he left. After that, she stopped mentioning it. She accepted that her pain had become invisible, not because it was mild, but because it was inconvenient. Versailles preferred its women beautiful, silent, and alive. Maria Anna was none of those things anymore. One night, when the fever was at its worst, she whispered to her confessor, "If my soul leaves me tonight, tell them I forgive them all, not because they deserve it, but because I cannot take bitterness with me." The priest wrote those words down later, describing them as the most perfect act of resignation I have ever seen. And yet, resignation did not mean peace. As she drifted in and out of delirium, Maria Anna began to dream of her homeland, the snowy courtyards of Munich, the scent of pine, the sound of church bells. Sometimes she woke weeping softly, asking her maid in German, "Bin ich schon vergessen?" Am I already forgotten? No one answered, because everyone already knew. In the palace of mirrors and light, the Dauphine was fading, unseen, unacknowledged, and unloved. Her body had become a battlefield where infection waged its slow, silent war. But to Versailles, it was merely a spectacle gone dull, a shadow in a hall that demanded brilliance. And somewhere beneath the golden ceilings, the first whispers began. The Dauphine is dying. Spoken not with sorrow, but with relief. By the time Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria's illness could no longer be hidden, Versailles had already turned it into a form of theater. The same courtiers who once bowed to her in silk and jewels now whispered behind their fans, transforming her suffering into entertainment. The palace that never slept, that pulsed with gossip, beauty, and vanity, had found in her decay a new spectacle, a slow death wrapped in lace. They called her La Grosse Dauphine. The nickname that had begun as a cruel jest about her shyness and plumpness now returned with venomous delight. It was repeated in salons, in the gardens, in the gilded corridors, until even the servants whispered it under their breath. The swelling of her abdomen, a symptom of the infection destroying her organs, was treated as gluttony. The Dauphine, they said, had grown fat from indulgence. Perhaps she eats her prayers, one wit remarked at a banquet. Laughter followed, elegant and merciless. No one corrected them. The court was built on cruelty. It was the only language Versailles truly spoke. To survive there was to laugh first, before being laughed at. And so Maria Anna's pain became another story told over dessert, another diversion from boredom. She tried, for a time, to appear in public. Dressed in layers of satin that hid her frail frame, her skin powdered to mask the sickly yellow hue, she forced herself to attend the king's dinners and processions. The effort nearly killed her each time. Her corset cut into her swollen belly. Her breath came shallow, trembling. The lights of the chandeliers blurred her vision, and the music of the violins seemed to echo from somewhere very far away. When she appeared, the courtiers would rise, bow, and then, once she had passed, resume their whispers. "Look at her complexion," one duchess murmured. "She is fading like an old candle." Another replied, "No, she is simply too pious to live." To them, her illness was not tragedy, but inconvenience, a flaw in the choreography of perfection that Versailles demanded. Her husband, the Grand Dauphin Louis, no longer hid his absence. He visited her chambers rarely, and when he did, he stood at a distance, as though afraid of contagion. He spent his nights with mistresses who mocked the Dauphine openly. Once, one of them, Mademoiselle de Chouin, was said to have entered a masquerade dressed as the ghost of patience, a cruel parody understood by all. Laughter filled the hall. Maria Anna heard of it from one of her ladies, who tried to soften the details. But the Dauphine only smiled faintly. "They may mock patience," she whispered, "because they have never needed it." Her words were not bitter. They were simply weary. As her illness advanced, the ridicule grew darker. The courtiers began to speculate about her body, her smells, her weight, her silence. The same lips that once praised her piety now spread rumors that her sickness was punishment for hidden sins. "Perhaps she has offended God," some said. Others preferred a more fashionable cruelty. "Perhaps she pretends to be ill for attention." Versailles needed explanation, and when it could not find one, it invented. The king himself maintained a distant courtesy. Louis XIV disliked reminders of mortality. His world was built upon light, chandeliers, mirrors, gold. Death, disease, and decay were intrusions that threatened his illusion of divine order. He ordered that her condition be discussed in whispers only, never in his presence. "The Dauphine requires rest," he said politely, "but France is strong." It was both a command and an erasure. In her private rooms, Maria Anna's world had shrunk to the size of her bed. Curtains were drawn to block drafts, but the air grew stale, thick with the smell of candle wax and fever. She could no longer walk without pain. Even sitting upright exhausted her. Yet she refused to lose her dignity. When visitors came, ambassadors, ladies of the court, sometimes even the Dauphin, she smiled with trembling lips and greeted them in perfect French. "Versailles must not see me undone," she once told her maid. They would rather watch than help. Sometimes, when she was alone, she would ask her attendants to open the window just a little. The air outside was cold, sharp with winter frost, but she preferred it to the stifling perfume of the palace. She would look out toward the gardens, the fountains, the frozen ponds, the distant statues, and whisper prayers in German, the language of her childhood. The maids often heard her say, "Mutter, ich komm heim." Mother, I am coming home. The mocking, however, continued even as her strength faded. One evening, during a grand supper, a nobleman recounted how the Dauphine had been carried to her balcony to catch a bit of air. She looked like a statue of suffering, he joked. If the king ordered her cast in marble, we might call it the Patience of Bavaria. The courtiers laughed. Some crossed themselves afterward, half in shame, half in superstition. But the cruelty lingered. It was not just gossip that wounded her. It was the indifference that surrounded it. Even her attendants, kind though they were, had learned to accept her suffering as routine. Her pain became part of the furniture. Another detail in the endless etiquette of Versailles. "Madame is resting," they would say politely to visitors, though resting meant shaking with fever, coughing blood, or lying still from exhaustion. Late at night, when the palace quieted, she could hear the distant sound of music, the muffled laughter of a masquerade, the faint hum of violins drifting through the corridors. Sometimes she imagined the sound was coming from heaven, other times from a world that had already forgotten her. "They dance," she whispered once to her confessor, "as if death does not exist." He answered gently, "Here. Perhaps it doesn't. At Versailles, even sorrow must wear powder." Her laughter at that was faint but real, the laughter of someone who finally saw through the illusion. "Then I shall be their last scandal," she said softly, "the one who dares to die." By early 1689, the Dauphine was little more than a shadow of the girl who had arrived 9 years before. Her once bright eyes were now dull with pain. Her hair, once brushed daily by her maids, had begun to fall out in handfuls. Still, Versailles moved on. New plays were staged, new mistresses crowned, new fashions adored. Her name appeared less and less in the conversations of the elite. The courtiers who had mocked her would later claim they had pitied her all along. But pity, in Versailles, was just another mask, worn briefly, then discarded before the next ball. And while the palace glittered with laughter and light, Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria lay in darkness, her body breaking quietly, her dignity intact. The court had reduced her to a rumor, a cautionary tale, a fading portrait in the gallery of forgotten faces. Yet even as her body failed, her spirit, wounded, patient, and resolute, remained the one thing Versailles could not ridicule. For though they mocked her weakness, it was she, not they, who bore her pain with grace. And in a world where cruelty was fashionable, grace was the rarest defiance of all. By 1689, Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria lived like a prisoner within her own body. The walls of her chamber had become the limits of her world. The silk canopy above her bed, a fragile sky under which she fought, breath by breath, to stay alive. The courtiers called her the invisible Dauphine now, a polite way of saying that she no longer mattered. She was neither a political tool nor a social ornament. She had become, in every sense, an inconvenience Versailles preferred to forget. Her body was deteriorating faster than anyone dared to admit. The infection that had begun in her lungs and abdomen now spread relentlessly. She could no longer eat without pain. Her hands trembled so violently that her attendants had to feed her with small spoons, wiping away what spilled. The swelling in her stomach had grown so severe that she could barely move without crying out. yet her tears were silent. Versailles did not allow weeping. The royal doctors continued to visit, still pretending to understand what they could not cure. They drained her abdomen of fluid with primitive instruments, leaving her weaker each time. The bloodletting, the herbal poultices, the endless tonics, none of it worked. Her fever rose, her pulse quickened, her skin turned cold and clammy. "Your body resists treatment," one physician told her, as if it were her fault. She only nodded, whispering, "It resists living too." The pain was constant, but worse than the pain was the isolation. The Dauphin rarely visited. The king, who once praised her for bearing sons, had long since moved his attention to other matters of grandeur. Even her children, raised by tutors and nurses, were kept from her sick room for fear of contagion. She could hear them playing in the distant gardens, their laughter faint but piercing, the sound of life moving forward without her. In her diary, she wrote, "I can hear them through the window. The sound of my sons laughing makes my heart ache with both joy and mourning. They belong to the future. I belong to what is ending." To endure the endless hours, she turned to music, or rather, to memory. Her attendants would hum softly the hymns she used to play on the harpsichord in Bavaria. Sometimes she asked them to stop halfway through, saying the melodies reminded her too much of the person she once was. "That woman is gone," she whispered. "I feel as though I'm living inside her ghost." She had once loved painting, embroidery, the careful work of hands creating something delicate. But her hands now trembled too violently to hold a needle or a brush. "My body betrays every beauty I ever loved," she told her maid, her voice breaking. "It steals the language through which I once prayed." The palace did not notice her despair, but a few souls did. One was Sister Hélène, a nun from the nearby convent of Saint-Cyr, whom Maria Anna requested as her companion. The nun visited discreetly, sitting beside her bed and reading aloud from the Psalms. The Dauphine would listen in silence, her lips moving soundlessly to the verses she knew by heart. Once, after a long pause, she said, "I no longer fear death, sister. I only fear that I will die unheard." The nun replied gently, "He hears you, madame. Even silence is a form of prayer." But Maria Anna's silence was filled with something heavier, not only faith, but resignation. She had spent years learning how to be small, invisible, and compliant. Now her illness had made her the perfect subject for Versailles, a woman who existed without disturbing anyone. The night hours were the hardest. The palace, once alive with light and laughter, became eerily quiet. The flicker of candles threw long shadows against her bed curtains, shapes that seemed to breathe and shift with her fever. In those hours, she often spoke to the shadows as if they were old friends. "You understand me," she murmured once. "You too have no faces." Her attendants grew accustomed to her whispering. Some pitied her, others feared her, not because she was frightening, but because she embodied something they all wished to ignore: mortality. "The Dauphine sees ghosts," they whispered. But the truth was simpler. She was not seeing death. She was rehearsing it. Her one constant companion was her maid, Claire, who had come with her from Bavaria years earlier. Claire brushed her hair each morning, though much of it had fallen out, and read her letters from home. Maria Anna's voice was often too weak to answer. One day, Claire found her weeping silently and asked what troubled her. The Dauphine replied, "My body is a house that burns from within, and I am trapped in every room." To Claire, who loved her dearly, those words felt like a prayer disguised as despair. She tried to comfort her, but Maria Anna only smiled faintly. "Do not mourn me yet," she said. "There are still walls to collapse." As spring returned to Versailles, the palace came alive once more. Flowers bloomed in the gardens, and new dresses appeared at court, their colors bright and mocking. The fountains sang again, celebrating the vitality of the Sun King's realm. But inside her chamber, Maria Anna's world remained dim. The curtains stayed drawn, the air still thick with the scent of fever and rosewater. Occasionally, she asked to be moved to the window. Her attendants would lift her carefully, propping her up with cushions. She would gaze out at the sunlight, blinking against its brightness. Once she whispered, "The world looks the same. How strange that I am the only thing that has changed." When the pain grew unbearable, she asked her confessor to stay through the night. He found her gripping the edge of her sheets, her breath ragged. "Why does he not take me?" she asked through clenched teeth. "I have been patient. I have forgiven. Why must I remain?" The priest answered softly, "Perhaps because your patience is the lesson others must learn." She let out a trembling laugh, almost bitter, almost serene. "Then may they learn it quickly," she said. By the end of that year, her condition had worsened beyond concealment. Her limbs were swollen, her voice nearly gone. Yet even in her weakness, there was a kind of radiance, not of beauty, but of endurance. Visitors who saw her wept quietly afterward. "She looks already half in heaven," one courtier wrote, "and half entombed." Maria Anna herself seemed to know this. In one of her final letters, written with the help of Claire, she confessed, "I am no longer afraid. The body that once imprisoned me is crumbling, and soon, perhaps, the door will open. Tell my sons I was not sad to leave. I was only tired of being unseen." And with that letter sealed and sent to Bavaria, the woman who had once arrived in Versailles as a diplomatic bride, radiant, hopeful, and full of life, prepared, quietly and alone, for the only freedom that remained to her, the freedom of death. By the spring of 1690, Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria had become so light that her maids could lift her as if she were made of air. Her once round body was reduced to bone beneath the embroidered sheets. She had long since stopped asking for mirrors. Her reflection had become a stranger. The infection that had eaten away her lungs and liver now ruled her body completely. Every breath was shallow, a small victory over something vast and merciless. Yet even as her body betrayed her, she held onto one last role, not as a Dauphine, not as a princess, but as a mother. Her children were the only pieces of her life that Versailles could not take away. She had borne them at great cost, and now she clung to the thought of them as a drowning woman clings to light. The eldest, Louis, was 8. The second, Philip, was 6. The youngest, Charles, not yet 5. They were bright, curious, and loved by the court, living symbols of the Bourbon dynasty. But they were rarely allowed to see their mother. Their tutors and nurses said the Dauphine's condition was unfit for young eyes. In Versailles, sickness was indecent, as if suffering itself were contagious to beauty. Maria Anna pleaded softly, day after day, to see them. For weeks, the court refused. Her Majesty must not exhaust herself, the doctors insisted. The presence of children will only disturb her. But when the king was away and her condition clearly terminal, her old Bavarian maid Claire defied the orders. One quiet afternoon in April, she arranged for the children to be brought in. The door opened softly. 3 small figures entered, uncertain, nervous, dressed in perfect miniature court attire. They hesitated at the sight of their mother, who no longer looked like the woman they remembered. Her face was thin and waxy, her lips pale as parchment. Yet when she saw them, her eyes filled with a light that had not been there in months. "My angels," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but the words were music. The children stood near the foot of the bed, unsure whether to approach. The eldest, Prince Louis, bowed stiffly, already trained in royal decorum. But little Charles ran forward, reaching for her hand. She managed to lift it, trembling, and placed it against his cheek. The contact brought tears to her eyes. "You are so warm," she murmured. "I had forgotten what warmth feels like." For a moment, time seemed suspended. Versailles, with all its gossip, cruelty, and noise, faded away. There was only the fragile circle of a dying mother and her sons. She spoke to each of them, pausing often for breath. To Louis, the heir, she said, "Be kind. Strength without kindness is only pride. Remember that your crown is heavy because it rests on the hearts of others." To Philip, she whispered, "You were born laughing. Never lose that. The world will try to silence joy. Defend it, my love." And to Charles, the child who had nearly killed her during birth, she smiled faintly. "You cost me my life," she said softly, "but you also gave it meaning. I have no anger toward you, my son. Only love, the kind that does not end when breath does." The boy did not understand her words, but he felt their weight. He began to cry, clutching her hand as if he could keep her from slipping away. She soothed him with slow strokes, humming a lullaby from Bavaria, a melody her own mother had sung to her decades earlier. The sound was faint, like wind passing through reeds, but it filled the room with something purer than pity, peace. When the nurse finally came to take the children away, Maria Anna did not protest. She watched them go with calm resignation, her eyes following the smallest until the door closed. Only then did she allow herself to collapse against the pillows, her strength spent. "They are beautiful," she whispered. "Tell the king I did not fail him after all." That night, she asked for confession. Her priest knelt beside her bed, but she spoke little. Her sins, she said, were not of the body, but of the heart. For having doubted that gentleness could survive here. She received communion with trembling hands, tears spilling silently down her face. "I am ready," she said, "but I wish I had lived in a world that knew how to forgive softness." The next morning, April 20th, 1690, the fever returned with brutal clarity. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her chest rattling like broken glass. The doctors gathered but could do nothing. They spoke in Latin, as though ceremony could disguise helplessness. Claire knelt at her side, holding her hand. "Madame," she whispered, "shall I summon the Dauphin?" Maria Anna shook her head weakly. "No. He would be late and I would have to wait. Let him remember me as sleeping." For hours, she drifted in and out of consciousness. Between the waves of pain, she murmured prayers, half in French, half in German. The languages intertwined like threads of her divided life. Around noon, the sunlight spilled through the window, illuminating the bed in a pale gold. She opened her eyes once more and said, "It is beautiful today. I hope the children are playing outside." Those were her last clear words. As her breathing slowed, Claire leaned close and heard her whisper, barely audible, "I forgive them all." When the final breath escaped her, it was quiet. No cry, no struggle, just a faint exhalation. as if the palace had finally allowed her to rest. Versailles continued as if nothing had happened. The bells rang once, perfunctorily. The king ordered a modest funeral, befitting her station but not excessive. Her body, fragile and wasted, was carried to the royal crypt at Saint-Denis. The courtiers bowed as it passed, some murmuring that she had been a good woman, but not made for France. In truth, France had not been made for her. That night, as the palace returned to its usual music and chatter, a single candle burned in her darkened chamber. Claire, kneeling beside the empty bed, whispered the same lullaby Maria Anna had sung to her son. Its final verse lingered in the still air. Schlaf, mein Kind. The world forgets, but heaven remembers. And so the Dauphine of France, mocked for her body, dismissed for her gentleness, and unseen in her suffering, left the world exactly as she had lived in it, quietly, faithfully, and alone. The death of Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria passed through Versailles like a faint ripple across still water, noticed, then gone. The Sun King, Louis XIV, received the news with calm composure as he prepared for his morning audience. God has called her, he said simply, and returned to dictating state papers. There was no pause in the day's schedule, no curtain drawn over the mirrors of the palace, no mourning period that reflected the gravity of a young life extinguished. Versailles, ever radiant, refused to dim its light for anyone, not even for the Dauphine of France. Her husband, the Grand Dauphin Louis, was informed during breakfast. He looked up briefly from his plate, nodded, and murmured, "May she rest in peace." Then he asked for the sauce to be passed. His courtiers, sensing his mood, quickly changed the subject to the upcoming hunt. Within an hour, laughter filled the table again. Grief, at Versailles, was not a duty. It was a nuisance. The funeral arrangements were carried out swiftly, more as a formality than an act of reverence. Louis XIV ordered that the Dauphine be buried in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, among the kings and queens of France. But the ceremony was to be dignified and simple. In royal language, that meant minimal expense and minimal attention. The kingdom must not linger in sorrow, he explained. We celebrate life, not death. His words, like much of his reign, were less about faith and more about control. Versailles could not afford sentiment. Emotion was weakness, and weakness was unbecoming of a son. Her coffin was small, painfully so, for her body had wasted to almost nothing. It was draped in white silk embroidered with the fleur-de-lis, the emblem of the monarchy that had consumed her life. Few attended the ceremony. The Dauphin stood at the front, impassive, his face powdered to perfection. Behind him, a handful of courtiers whispered about how quickly they would need to prepare the apartments for a new Dauphine, as France could not long be without one. The priest spoke briefly of her virtues, her piety, her gentleness, her obedience. He did not mention her suffering. He did not mention how the same court that now stood in solemn silence had mocked her illness for years. He did not speak of her loneliness or the quiet courage it took to die with forgiveness on her lips. Those truths did not fit the ritual. Versailles preferred its dead polished, purified of their pain. When the coffin was lowered into the vault, the air was cool and echoing. A thin mist of candle smoke hung above the mourners. Claire, her faithful maid, stood at the back, weeping silently. She had begged to attend despite her low rank, and someone, perhaps out of pity, had allowed it. When the last prayer was spoken, she placed a small wooden cross, carved from Bavarian pine, upon the coffin. It was the only object in the crypt that carried the scent of home. Outside, life resumed its pace. The same evening, the king hosted a performance of Les Amants Magnifiques in the Palace Theatre. Music, laughter, and applause filled the halls that had so recently held the whispers of death. Those who noticed the irony did not speak of it. To question Versailles was to question the order of the cosmos itself. In the days that followed, her name began to fade from conversation. Servants were reassigned, her rooms aired out, her portraits quietly removed from display. Within a week, they were hanging new tapestries, covering the walls that had once echoed with her prayers. Her clothes were given away to ladies of lower rank, her jewelry stored for future brides. The Sun King had no use for ghosts. The Dauphin wore black for a few days, as etiquette required, but his mourning was as superficial as the powder on his face. Soon, he returned to his amusements, hunting, gambling, and his mistresses. Those close to him said that he seemed almost relieved. "She was too delicate for this world," he remarked once. "Better she rests." The words sounded compassionate, but beneath them lay something colder. Indifference, disguised as grace. Even her children, too young to understand, were shielded from grief. They were told their mother had gone to heaven, that she was with the angels. The youngest, Charles, asked if the angels would let her come back. The nurse smiled and changed the subject. In the palace gardens, where Maria Anna had once longed to walk, the boys played under the same sunlight that had watched her die. They laughed, and the world, indifferent, continued to turn. In Munich, her father received the news with deep sorrow. The Bavarian court held a solemn mass in her honor, and her mother's chapel filled with the scent of burning wax and lilies. There, far from Versailles, someone finally spoke of her as she was, not as a title, but as a daughter. Her sister wept openly. Her father, too proud to cry, simply said, "She was too gentle for France." But in France itself, she was already vanishing. The courtiers replaced her memory with the next scandal, the next intrigue. Versailles had no patience for ghosts. The mirrors that once reflected her image now showed only faces of the living, powdered, painted, and ambitious. For the king, her death was an administrative note, a minor interruption in the celestial machinery of his reign. Yet somewhere, beyond the palace walls, her absence began to haunt the air in quieter ways. Servants spoke of hearing faint footsteps in the Dauphine's former apartments, or the scent of rosewater lingering where none had been used. Some said that when the candlelight dimmed, a soft voice whispered prayers in German. The language Versailles never cared to learn. History would barely remember her. In official records, she was reduced to a few lines. Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria, Dauphine of France, born 1660, died 1690. Married to Louis, son of Louis XIV, mother of 3 princes. That was all. No mention of the pain, the dignity, or the strange holiness of her endurance. But those who had stood close enough to see her suffering, the priest, the maid, a few kind-hearted servants, knew what the records did not. They had watched her die as she had lived, quietly, gracefully, and without resentment. And though the world forgot her, there remained in their memories the image of a woman whose patience was stronger than power, whose silence outlasted the laughter of Versailles. When the candles burned low that night in the great palace, the mirrors shimmered faintly, as if reflecting not the faces of the living, but the ghost of a young woman who had once stood among them, radiant and kind. No one noticed. Versailles had moved on. But somewhere, beyond the noise and gold, the silence of Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria endured. A silence too soft for kings to hear, but too deep for history to erase. History would remember her only in fragments. A name in a genealogy, a faded portrait of a quiet woman in pearls. But the irony was cruel and magnificent. The woman Versailles mocked, ignored, and buried without tears became the silent mother of two thrones. Through her sons, the blood of Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria flowed into both the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of Spain. Her firstborn's line would lead to Louis XV, the monarch who ruled for half a century. Her second son, Philip, became Philip V of Spain, founder of the Bourbon dynasty that endures even now. The Dauphine, who had been dismissed as weak, gave birth unknowingly to an empire's future. Versailles never spoke her name again. But each time a Bourbon crown was placed upon a royal head, it rested quietly, invisibly, on the fragile legacy of the woman who died at 29, forgiving the world that had forgotten her. In that silence, Maria Anna's true victory lived on. Not in marble, not in memory, but in blood, in lineage, and in the quiet defiance of a heart that never hardened.